When I stopped looking at beliefs as either right or wrong, right? They're just either, I look at them as more of like they either add value or they take value away. And that's kind of what you're talking about here on approaching these cognitive biases or getting real with them, right? That's kind of another step. I know we don't got a lot of time to get into this, but I just wanted to at least bring that up, that, right? This is an important part of the journey. And what you were talking about just now, it kind of reminded me of that, right? That we have to get real with these cognitive biases. Am I on the right track?
Absolutely, yeah. There are books at this point that document like thousands of cognitive biases that we all have systemically. So it's not just a bad belief or a bad decision. It's something that affects many of our decisions. And there are ways that you can become better at dealing with them, become more aware of them, and even eliminate these cognitive biases, right? So, a simple example, you've got the confirmation bias. That's a pretty huge one, right? We have this tendency to want to seek out things that basically reinforce our existing worldview.
Yeah. So that's why I'm gonna find news sources and people around me that's just gonna support everything that I believe.
If I'm against something, I'm gonna start talking to other people. If I'm against the current administration, I'm going to watch Fox News, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm going to reinforce. Right. I look at it as a position. We talk about position. I'm going to become positional, and I'm going to justify then my behavior based on my position, right?
Right. And once you sort of label and start noticing these patterns around you, you can become increasingly aware of these things. So you can start catching yourself when you're typing in a Google search that you're kind of skewing in one direction or you're kind of ignoring some of the results because they don't tell you what you want to hear. You start noticing that in real time and you start saying, okay, well, this is a bias. I need to work against this, The planning fallacy is another example. You can get to where you are much better at predicting how well you'll meet deadlines just by observing how well you've met the same kind of deadline before, instead of just asking yourself, well, how long do I feel like this will take? Because very often it's like triple what we feel like it'll take at the time. So there are a lot of these biases, and some of them very much are these sort of self-limiting beliefs where we have this bias where we tell ourselves that I'm not this kind of person, I'm not the creative type of person, I'm not a business person, whatever it may be, right? We've got this bias that probably is rooted in pretty deeply and maybe even into our childhood, right? It simply may not be true if we haven't really experimented and shown ourselves that whether the bias is true or not, we may end up, choosing a life that's way worse than we could have just because we've convinced ourselves that we are or aren't a certain type of person.
So what did you learn from product design that you have applied to designing the mind? I mean, how do the two kind of mesh?
Well, it's product design, and also when I was looking into computer science, there's a lot of that has been blended in too. But essentially looking at the mind as this machine that, has been initially designed and sort of shaped by natural selection, and realizing that we're kind of able to uniquely design and program our own psychological operating system. And so the basic principles of creative problem solving in the design process of looking at, the mind as a set of systems, trying to understand those systems and find the leverage points for creating change, looking at individual, I like to say, psychological algorithms, how they work and how you can go in and rewire them so that you have a different mental, emotional experience. I think all of those things in my background kind of blended together. And then obviously there's the component of just getting to design the physical products, and the branding and everything has been really a ton of fun with designing the mind. And so I start the book in the cognitive realm, looking at cognitive biases and distortions, and saying, how do we actually change them once we notice them? Going through a lot of the most common biases and fallacies that we've observed, and why they're mistaken, and how you can sometimes go in and revise them. And then it really, to me, gets most interesting when we start looking at how those biases and distortions cause
all these different moods and how we can go in and alter them using, psychotechnologies, essentially changing those negative algorithms into positive algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And the process would be similar for emotions. Are there emotional biases just similar to cognitive biases?
That's how I understand it. Essentially, we've got a whole collection of cognitive biases, and some have a very significant implications for our moods and emotions, particularly when they are fallacies that relate to ourselves. In Feeling Good, a fantastic book for people who are struggling with depression, self-esteem, he breaks down 10 different distortions that he observes in depressed patients that have been observed a million times. Things like black and white thinking. Things like, you miss an appointment and you say, I always do this. I'm always missing appointments. I can't do anything right. Well, there's a whole gradient there. There's a whole degree. How many of your appointments do you successfully make it to? The majority, but I missed this one. So going in and recognizing that whole range and saying, no, actually, you should say you're 95% good at making it to your appointments. You're not worthless and incompetent. So going through each of those, identifying which ones are affecting you and sort of learning how to replace them with alternative balance beliefs. Absolutely invaluable skill. Everyone should be doing this.
Talk about cognitive biases, and I know there's many, but I feel like there's a lot of that goes around everywhere now. Can you double click on one of those that you think is common that people deal with unknowingly?
Sure. I think one of the most pernicious is confirmation bias. And contrary to what you might think, you actually can get a lot better at this. There's a book I really like called Scout Mindset that's all about shifting to a mindset where you're no longer trying to confirm what you already believe. You're no longer identifying with specific beliefs, but instead you are identifying as someone who will update your beliefs in the face of new information and sort of being independent in the way you develop views. And so, I talk about it like, a good software developer will every day be looking to make improved iterations to their software and won't be, attached to one. And we can approach our beliefs in the same way instead of latching onto this and saying, this is right. This is what I'm going to build my identity around, saying, okay, it's a new day. How do I iterate on this? How can I challenge this view and maybe adopt a better one with new information? And so
that's interesting. I am totally guilty of that. I have this subconscious desire to be right too much.
Yeah.
And I know it's it can be a feature, but it's mostly a bug. It's a feature in some ways. I've helped a lot of people over the years because of my desire to try to figure out what's true about maybe a health intervention that helps this person feel better in their body or whatever. But it's also a bug. It also interferes with me being what I would like to be, the version I would like to be of myself, where I can more quickly be kind before being right.
Mm-hmm.
If you know what I mean. What would be an example of how to approach altering, tweaking or rediverting that habit? So you're going to search something. If you go in and just say, I want to search something that contradicts what my current belief is, that might make you not get to any solution that's useful for you.
Right.
How do you approach the query or the selection of the results?
Yeah, I very much have a desire to be right too. And it definitely comes out if I get in, arguments in my relationships more than anything, I think. So I relate to that. I think the solution that I've sort of laid out, and it's not quick or simple necessarily, but it's sort of taking an inventory of the things that, one, you believe, but two, you want to believe. I even created kind of a diagram. There's over 100 diagrams in this first book, showing sort of drawing a different length of arrow for each belief based on how much you want it to be true or not true. And ultimately, while beliefs are not a bad thing, and obviously we need to believe things if we're going to make sense of the world in any way and make decisions, desires to hold specific beliefs are a bad thing. And so when we do notice those, we take an inventory and we say, I really want to believe this. That should sort of trigger a red flag in our mind. We should say, okay, I need to get away from this attachment that I have toward this belief. And this same approach applies to emotional attachments and things like that. We can sort of cancel out our desires in some cases. And in this case, you really want to spend some time with that belief that you really want to hold and its opposite, and get yourself one way or another to a place where you could be okay with believing one thing or another. That's not an easy thing for a lot of people, especially given like social circles where everyone in your life wants this one thing to be true and would treat you like an outcast if you went against it. But ultimately, I think there are ways to rework this so you can believe, or you can at least be willing to believe the opposite. It wouldn't be so painful for you. I think just gradually reworking your identity over time to the point where it doesn't center around that one thing being true, but instead around following whatever seems to be most likely to be true, I think is really helpful. Like you can get to where you really take pride in holding like one particular contrarian view, even though a lot of your views seem to be on one side. And so, just an awareness of those desires to hold beliefs and building equal and opposite desires to sort of cancel them out.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it probably, because of like how things have changed over the last 100 or so years so rapidly, the tribal component, our need to like fit in and be a part of a group, combined with the current flow of information, probably like ignites this fire of suffering that of these biases, and just like is kind of like gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, so our beliefs aren't really built to be like accurate. That's not really why the whole belief module exists in our brain in the first place. It is primarily for communal bonding. It's to bring us together with our tribe. And I agree, it does very much become a problem when you create an internet ecosystem that just feeds us more of what we want to hear and amplifies the loudest, most outraged voices. It's all very much a recipe for disaster. But yeah, I think the approach that's needed is both a psychological one where individuals adopt a mindset of centered around critical thinking and this kind of scout mindset, and systemic solutions that change, the way these algorithms work that sort of pull us into echo chambers. In the first book, I talk about how we can change the kind of micro psychological habits that I call algorithms in our minds, the connections between thoughts and emotions.
Can you give me an example of one of these micro habits?
Yeah, so a good example I always like to look at is how our perceptions and thoughts affect our emotions. So, we've got a lot of cases where it's not an event itself that triggers a negative emotion, even if it seems like a negative event. There's kind of this if-then relationship between the event and then the thought that we have and the belief underlying it and the emotion. So if you've got certain negative algorithms in place, when something bad happens to you, you don't get the job that you were hoping for, then you will automatically think certain negative thoughts like, oh, I'm never going to get a good job. I'm hopeless, right? And then that thought like in turn, CBT, very much CBT based set of ideas, yeah. And so there's a lot of
habit then be something more like what James Clear is kind of talking about, because this is kind of much deeper below the hood, right?
Well, it connects to that too. I mean, it's kind of divided in three parts: cognition, which is looking at cognitive biases, that kind of thing; emotion, which is dealing with this CBT kind of thing; and then behavior too, which talks about James Clear and these habits. And so it's looking at how all these things are interconnected and make up psychological habits, even if they aren't visible on the outside. So this interconnected sort of network of if-then relationships, the psychological software that's basically running our subjectivity. and how we can go in and reprogram it essentially.
How do you find this awareness of this metacognition, the biases? How does it help you in the moment when you're actually feeling stressed out?
So another thing to mention first is that it can be very helpful to study the sort of existing and more or less universal biases out there. There are websites like Less Wrong. There are tons of lists out there of just all the cognitive biases that are generally found across the human race. And although familiarity isn't probably going to do a lot for you by itself, it's sort of an important initial step. You want to know the types of mistakes that your mind is likely to make habitually. But so then once you've done both of those things, once you're fairly observant into what's going on in your own mind, and you know some of the things to look out for and some of the biases, you will start finding these things appearing in your life. You will start finding, you can take the fundamental attribution error where, an example would be, if you're late for work, you tend to think, oh, well, I was late because I was in traffic, because this happened, because that happened. If someone else is late for work, you tend to think, oh, well, they're late because they're a lazy person or something. So we have these biases that are generally found. And when you are aware of it and you're paying attention to yourself, you'll often see these things pop up and you'll say, oh, I just found an example of that bias in myself. I need to work on this, right? And what you want to do is really focus on that initial belief that's essentially creating that, and put together some kind of strategy for altering it.